Hey guys, so we've been talking over the past bit about different principles of the Constitution and ultimately what was important among our founding principles and what makes the US, basically. And so today I wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing federalism. In theory, in many ways, this is probably a little bit of review because we spent a little bit of time talking about forms of government. But either way, let's take a little bit of a deeper look. So let's start with a little bit of review. So, immediately after the revolution, the U.S. was without a government. The revolution occurred basically because they were tired of the king, and the unitary government that went along with it, and they just wanted to be rid of it because they were tired of all of these yellow-suited people telling everybody what to do. So they just went, the complete opposite direction and decided to go ahead and try a Confederate form of government with the Articles of Confederation. So, as a reminder, that Confederate form of government is where all of the power of the government is at the state level, the local level, as opposed to at the national level. So they gave that a try. But the problem with the Articles of Confederation is that it was just way too loosely organized. Each of the states had their own currency, and it was impossible to trade amongst the different states because everybody had their own form of cash. It was really difficult to travel because each state had their own different laws, and nobody really knew what to expect. There wasn't any sort of national form of military in case anything ever happened. And they had realized that was a really terrible organization and decided that they should take another look at how to organize all of that. So, when they came back together to draft the Constitution, they made the compromise choice. They knew that the Confederate form wasn't working, they knew that they didn't want a unitary, so they tried federalism. Now, federalism, as a reminder, as you can see in this huge blue text and smaller red text, is basically a form of government where there is shared power between the national level and the state level. So both levels have a certain amount of power. And this was seen as a good compromise between the problems of unitary and the problems of confederate. So now that we have this federal form of government, how do they go about deciding which level would have which powers? Well, let's take a look. So the first thing that I want to mention here is that this particular workshop is going to include a lot of different key terms that you're going to want to keep track of. Most of them are related to the word powers. So there's a lot of different kinds of powers that we're going to discuss, and you're going to want to make sure that you have some kind of record of what they all are, because inevitably they're going to come up a bunch. So the first two that we'll talk about are delegated powers and expressed powers. And really they sort of mean the same thing. And what delegated powers and expressed powers are is that in the Constitution, if it explicitly says that the national government has a certain type of power, then the national government has that power. In fact, almost all of the powers of the national government come from delegated powers or expressed powers. That's pretty much where it comes from. If it doesn't explicitly say in the Constitution the national government has a particular power, then generally the national government does not have that power. So for example, the Constitution very specifically says that the President of the United States has the ability to declare war. That makes that an expressed power. That gives the President and the national government, of course, that power. Where it gets a little bit complicated, however, are implied powers, and that's your next key term. You're going to want to keep track of that, implied powers. And that comes from Article 1 of the Constitution. It's also known as the Elastic Clause if you're in trivia, and basically what it is a statement that says that in the future, as things develop past what the founders reasonably anticipated, if things change and a reasonable person would assume that the national government needed a certain power in order to, be able to manage this new thing, then it was considered necessary and proper for the government to have that power. So, of course, there's no way that the founders could have anticipated the internet. There's no way they could have seen that coming. So there are some rules and abilities that the national government has because it's necessary and proper that they have it. Obviously, it's not in the Constitution. There's no way it could have been. But it seemed necessary and proper that the government have the ability to do that. Same thing as with, like, the highways. They had no idea that there would be a national highway system that spans all of the states in the United States. But it's necessary and proper that the national government have the ability to regulate that, right? So that's kind of where the implied powers come in. However, there has been some claims that this clause has been to blame for some places in which the national government has taken more power than the founders originally imagined that they would have. Because, of course, my definition of a necessary and proper power might be totally different from your definition of a necessary and proper power for the national government to have. So there have been places and times at which this has come under, fire for accusations of abuse. But let's keep looking. So there's also ways in which the Constitution talks about powers that the national government doesn't have, and this is known as denied powers, basically. And in the Bill of Rights, there are some places where it specifically says powers the national government does not have. So one really great example is illegal searches and seizures. So the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights is really, really clear about the fact that the police do not have the right to just search all of your stuff without a warrant. It's a denied power. It also says in the Bill of Rights that the government does not have the ability to restrict your freedom of speech or your freedom to assemble. So there's a denied power. The national government does not have that power, and the Constitution says so. But also, since really the only powers that the national government has are the expressed powers and powers, that we could reasonably assume are necessary and proper based on those expressed powers, that if the Constitution does not talk about powers at all, then the national government has no way of getting those powers. So the question is, where do those powers go to? Well, those powers are known as reserved powers. If the national government or the Constitution does not give certain powers to the national level, but it also does not say that the powers are illegal for the states to have, then that means that all powers not discussed are reserved for the states. They're called reserved powers because they're reserved for the states. The states get those powers. So, for example, the Constitution says nothing about marriage law. It says nothing about, same-sex marriage. So, since it says nothing, that makes it a reserved power. That makes it a state law. The states have the ability to have that power. So that's why, for a while, there were a number of states that had, same-sex marriage and other states didn't, because it was a state issue. Also, the Constitution says nothing about marijuana law, as an example, so that makes it a reserved power. That's why states like Colorado have, more freedom of usage of marijuana than some other states do, because the Constitution says nothing about it, makes it a reserved power, goes to the states. Also, a couple more terms that are worth keeping track of are exclusive powers and concurrent powers. So when you're talking about exclusive powers, that basically just means that some of the powers of government go exclusively to the national level or go exclusively to the state level. So if we're looking at our Venn diagram, an exclusive power would be like only A or only B, right? Only state level or only national level. But there are some powers that are known as concurrent powers where they go to both A and B. In our Venn diagram, they'd go right in the center. So things like traffic law. Well, the states obviously have roads and streets. Like the streets of Napa, the national government's not going to come in and tell us what to do on the streets of Napa. They just don't have the ability to do that. So that makes it more of a state and local issue, which means that local traffics and roads are state power. But there's also those freeways and highways that we mentioned previously, and that's more of a national thing because they, cross through multiple states. So that's where you get traffic laws that have a little bit of connection to the state and a little bit of connection to the national powers. But perhaps more importantly than that is this idea of the supremacy clause, and ultimately what that means is no matter what laws are made anywhere, if there is ever a conflict in what anyone has to say with laws or who has what powers, the Constitution is always the most powerful law of the land, regardless of whether Congress is making laws or whatever. If they conflict with the Constitution will always be the most powerful. It was set that way by the founders, and will be that way unless there is an amendment, basically. And so I'll scroll down a little bit just to show you a graph of how that looks. And this is kind of a graph of the ways in which laws all sort of connect and which one has more power than others. So at the very bottom, you have your city and county charters and ordinances. And you can see down here that basically ordinances, statutes, laws, they're all basically synonyms. They mean the same thing. So you have city and county laws here. Well, more powerful than city and county laws are state laws. So state laws are more powerful than city laws. So if there's a conflict, state laws win. More powerful than state laws are state constitutions. So the state of California has a constitution, and our state constitution is more powerful than any of our local laws or any of the state laws. Well, even more powerful than the state constitution are acts of Congress and treaties. So basically, if there is something that Congress does, the National Congress, meaning like House of Representatives, and they pass a law, that is more powerful than state constitutions or state or local laws. But even more powerful than that is the U.S. Constitution. U.S. Constitution is the most powerful law of the land. Whenever there are any conflicts, it wins every time. This is sort of the hierarchy of how it all works and who wins in conflicts and which level of laws are most powerful. But again, Constitution is at the very, very top. And that, I think, is all that I would like to discuss about federalism for today.